1901 AD, the beginning of the 20th century. On May 28, 1901, during the reign of Muzaffaruddin Shah Qajar in Iran, British merchant William Knox D'Arcy received the privilege of discovering oil in Iran from the then government of Iran. Negotiations with Muzaffaruddin Shah began in 1901, and initially 20,000 were offered for exploration in 1,200,000 square kilometers, which, if oil was discovered, would be taken from Qajar Shah for 60 years. In contrast, the Iranian government accounted for 16% of the company's annual profit. To this end, D'Arcy hired George Bernard Reynolds, who had experience in drilling oil wells in the oil-rich areas of Sumatra, to explore underground reservoirs, as well as to design and carry out oil extraction and exploitation operations. At the end of 1902, Reynolds began drilling the first well in the Cha Sork in the Khazar Shuran area, as well as Shardin near the city of Ramhormuz, and at the same time prepared the drilling of another exploration well in the Naftun area, located in the current area of Masjid Soleiman. After several years of trying to explore oil in Iran and the failure of drilling operations, finally at 4 a.m. on May 26, 1908 in the Naftun area of Masjid Soleiman, the drilling rig passed from a land thickness of 300 meters and last hit the huge rock on the oil source, resulting in a depth of 1,180 feet, 360 meters, of oil with pressure. It erupted to a height of 50 feet, 15 meters, above the tip of the drilling rig. This event, which was the first oil exploration in the Middle East, completely changed Iran's economic and social life. After William Knox D'Arcy took the 60-year Iranian oil concession from Muzaffaruddin Shah, he sold his share to the Burma Oil Company. The company established a new company called Anglo-Persian Oil Company as one of its branches. Prior to World War I, the British Navy, led by Winston Churchill, took over the majority of the company, and during both World Wars, cheap Iranian oil supplied British warships. During the reign of Reza Shah Pahlavi, the court minister, Tamertash, began detailed and serious negotiations with Britain on the issue of oil. Iran wanted to make the following amendments to the D'Arcy contract. Increase its share of the company's annual profit from 16% to 25%, receive a fixed amount equivalent to 2 shillings per ton of exported oil, allocate a significant amount of the company's shares to the Iranian government, limit the company's operations in Iran. After several years of negotiations, no progress was made on the issues between the two sides, but the negotiations continued. These negotiations were later followed by Taghizadeh, Minister of Finance, and finally Reza Shah himself. As a result of these negotiations, the 1933 agreement was signed between the Iranian government and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company through the mediation of the Czechoslovak foreign minister. With the outbreak of World War II, despite the declaration of Iran's neutrality in 1941, the Allies occupied Iran. Then, with the British ultimatum, Reza Shah was forced to resign and leave Iran and hand over the kingdom to his crown prince, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. After the Allied occupation of Iran in World War II, the colonialists' rivalry over oil intensified. After facing the demand of oil companies, the Iranian government announced that the granting of any concessions should be postponed until after the war, because at the present time and due to the existence of the war, the economic situation of the countries is not clear. As a result, the request of all three governments was rejected. After the end of World War II, according to the 1943 agreement, Britain and the Soviet Union were required to withdraw their forces from Iran within 6 months after the end of the war. Not only did the Soviet Union not leave Iran, but it also introduced other forces to northern Iran. At this time, Gavam was the prime minister. One of Gavam's actions was to conclude an agreement signed between the Iranian government and the Soviet ambassador to Tehran. According to the agreement, Soviet forces would have to leave Iran within a month and a half, and it was decided to establish a joint Iranian-Soviet oil company, and its statute would be proposed to the 15th Parliament for approval within 7 months. On October 23, 1947, the members of the National Assembly approved a single article, the main goal of which was to cancel the Iran-Soviet oil contract. This single article also emphasized that giving any concessions to foreigners is prohibited and the government is obliged to take action from southern oil in order to uphold the rights of the Iranian nation. The British government was not dissatisfied with the passage of this single article, as it had cut off the Soviets' hands with Iran's oil resources. However, The British government entered into negotiations with the country's officials to ratify the agreement in order to maintain its dominance over the oil of the south and to prevent the exercise of the rights of the Iranian people. During the reign of Mohammad Reza Shah, Iran's oil industry was declared nationalized unilaterally and without agreement by Mossadegh, who had become prime minister, which had many consequences for Iran. The events that led to the nationalization of Iranian oil are as follows. In 1946, the strikes of the workers of the oil industry began in protest of wage and living conditions, which were suppressed in 1951. On July 17, 1949, Gas, representative of the British Oil Company, and Golshayan, Iran's Minister of Finance, made an amendment that was proposed by Prime Minister Razmara in the 16th Parliament. According to the Gas Golshayan contractor, the additional bill, the company's minimum annual payment to Iran, which was increased to 750,000 lira in the Darcy contract, was increased to 4 million lira, and in addition to Iran's 20% share of the profit, the amount of 4 shilling per ton of oil in the 1933 contract. It was increased to 6 shillings per ton. This contract will increase Iran's share to about 40%. Simultaneously with the announcement of the signing of the Gas Golshayan agreement, large-scale demonstrations were held by the National Front, and opposition and protests escalated. The National Front of Iran was established in 1949 by politicians such as Mohammad Mossadegh, Hossein Fatemi and Karim Sanjabi, and at the suggestion of Hossein Fatemi, proposed the nationalization of Iran's oil industry. Before the start of the nationalization of oil and before the Gas Golshayan negotiations, the Shah and the Prime Minister, Razmara, sought the implementation of the 50-50 model. This agreement was not approved by the National Assembly with the efforts of the minority of the 15th Parliament, especially Hussein Fatemi and Hussein Maki, and the Parliament rejected it, and instead the law on the nationalization of the oil industry was approved in the 16th term. Prime Minister Razmara disagreed with this procedure and said his famous sentence, "How does an Iran that can't make a picture want to run the oil industry?" Which made many people angry. Razmara was assassinated on March 7, 1951 by Khalil Tahmassebi, a member of the Fadayan-e-Islam group. The day after Razmara's assassination, on March 8, 1951, the Petroleum Commission announced a proposal to nationalize the oil industry, and it was approved on March 15. The British government submitted a petition to the International Court of Justice on May 28, 1951 as a lawsuit against Iran. Following the nationalization of Iran's oil, the British government made different reactions to this issue in economic and military affairs, which include the withdrawal of British personnel from the Abadan refinery, preventing the hiring of new foreign employees to run the Abadan refinery, British military presence in the Persian Gulf with warships, and Iran's oil embargo. Since the beginning of 1951, Iranian oil has been completely embargoed by Western countries. Other countries of the world joined the embargo, and the British companies that owned the oil of Iraq, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia increased production in these countries and compensated for the lack of Iranian oil. As a result, oil production in the Middle East in 1951, 1952 and 1953 increased by about 10% every year. This issue weakened Iran's economy. Iran's oil production decreased from 242 million barrels in 1950 to 10.6 million barrels in 1952. With the arbitrary nationalization of oil led by Mossadegh, Iran's 16% share in 59 subsidiaries of Anglo-Persian oil, in other countries, the most prominent of which are oil facilities in Britain and its colonies such as India and branches in oil-rich Arab countries such as Iraq, Libya, Kuwait and Qatar were established, ignored. According to Manocher Farmanfarma, a prominent Iranian oil expert of that time, the value of the company's assets around the world in 1949 was more than £254 million, of which only about £30 million was related to the income inside Iran. According to another statement, the value of the assets of the Anglo-Iranian oil company outside the borders of Iran was nearly 10 times the value of its assets inside Iran. As a rule, 16% of its revenues should go to Iran. Mossadegh, who by signing the oil nationalization law in November 1950, placed himself in the position of the leader of Iran's oil nationalization, involved Iran in the international regulations related to unilateral and arbitrary nationalization, in his own style and context. While the nationalization of a joint company between two countries in the manner implemented by Mossadegh, the nationalizing country will forever be deprived of all the rights claimed in the foreign branches of that company. and will force the nationalizing country to pay heavy compensations. The nationalization of the oil industry, in the manner he implemented, resulted in direct placement of Iran's national interests against British colonial interests, which Razmara recommended to avoid, was widely protested by other nationalization movement leaders and signatories of the oil nationalization law. Took and caused widespread and deep-rooted internal disputes. By firing the industrial managers of the nationalized company, Mossadegh deprived himself of the ability to produce, distribute and refine oil, and he knew that if he could miraculously produce and sell oil, he must deliver half of his income to Britain forever as compensation for nationalization. One of the most important reasons for the disagreement between the Shah and Mossadegh was Mossadegh's attempt to control the army. During his tenure as prime minister, Mossadegh tried to limit the power of the Shah, and he was successful in areas other than the military. At the time, the army remained largely loyal to the Shah and was influenced by his American military advisors. Although people in the top ranks of the army were supporters of Mossadegh, Mossadegh tried to remove the post of the Ministry of War from the Shah's control, but the Shah refused. Mossadegh resigned, but with the spread of protests, the Shah had to retreat. Mossadegh returned to power and exiled the Shah's family from the country. 1 year after the incident of July 21, 1952, on August 19, 1953, Shah's supporters managed to capture the radio building and other government centers. It was after that the Shah returned to Iran. Mossadegh was dismissed, imprisoned, and after the end of the prison term, he was exiled to Ahmedabad. After the events of August, the new Prime Minister, Fazlollah Zahidi, resumed relations with the British government that had been severed during Mossadegh's time. Oil negotiations started on April 11, 1954 under the supervision of the Minister of Economy and Finance, Dr. Ali Amini, which led to the consortium contract. According to the new contract, which was signed by the parties on September 19 and approved by the National Assembly on October 21 and approved by the Senate on October 28, although the nationalization of Iran's oil and oil industries was accepted by foreign parties, but the Iranian government guaranteed to sell the produced oil to the member companies of the consortium, American, English, Dutch and French, for 25 years. In this way, the sale of Iranian oil resumed in January 1955 after a break of nearly 4 years. Mohammad Reza Shah was determined to prevent the repetition of situations like Mossadegh's time. In 1954, the elections of the 18th Parliament were held in a controlled manner. In this parliament, like the following parliaments, only those loyal to the king could enter the parliament. In 1955, Fazlollah Zahidi resigned as prime minister and the Shah appointed Hossein Allah as prime minister. The first economic development plan of 1949 remained sterile due to the lack of oil revenues during the nationalization of the oil industry. But during the second economic development program between 1956 to 1962, numerous hydroelectric projects were implemented, which was partly due to the discovery of new oil fields around Qom in 1956. Since 1957, Iran concluded the first series of oil contracts based on partnership with foreign companies. These types of contracts were psychologically more satisfying for Iranians. With the outbreak of the Arab-Israeli War and the embargo on the sale of oil by Arab countries, the Shah refused to join the oil embargo. Iran overtook Arabia in terms of oil production and became the largest oil producer in the Middle East in 1970. Richard Nixon had to devalue the dollar twice, in 1971 and 1972, to deal with high oil prices. OPEC, led by the Shah, countered this move and raised oil prices twice, each time shortly after the dollar's depreciation. On the other hand, oil exploration inside the Persian Gulf waters allowed the Shah to conclude new exploration and extraction contracts with small and new companies outside the consortium. In the 10-year period from 1963 to 1973, the GDP increased 4 times and health standards increased dramatically. Nevertheless, the Shah's opponents made the most of every opportunity to humiliate the Shah and refused to accept any progress by the Shah. For example, the Shah's role in OPEC was cited as another document of the Shah's subservience to U.S. imperialism. They proposed the theory that the high price of oil is a burden on Japan and Europe and to the benefit of America. According to reports, the era of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi still holds the record for oil exports with the daily export of more than 6 million barrels of oil and its products in 1973. After the revolution of 1979 with the sanctions of the United States and the West, Iran's oil exports in 1980 decreased by 50% to about 2,800,000 barrels per day, which also decreased drastically during the years of the Iran-Iraq War. And during the 2 years of 1981 and 1982 reached about 900,000 barrels per day, which is the lowest level of oil export in the period before and after the Islamic Revolution. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe my channel. May ALD.